In CSS, a length is a numerical value plus a unit. And it's important to realize here that you cannot use white space between the number and the unit. Earlier in this course we said that white space wasn't important, but in this particular case it is. The number and the unit have to be together with no white space between them. Now the numerical value can be an integer or a real number, that's a decimal number. And the numerical value, if it's 0, you can forget the units, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about 0 centimeters or 0 millimeters, it's going to be the same. So if the numerical value is 0, then you can forget the unit. Otherwise, you have to include the unit with your measurement. Now to complicate things a little bit, units of length can be absolute or relative. Okay, now absolute measurements have fixed specific measurements, but they're only really useful if we know the screen resolution, and we'll have a look at that later. But if you think of absolute measurements, we're thinking about things you can measure and specify a length which would never change. So the absolute units we can use in CSS are millimeters, mm, centimeters, cm, inches, in, and then a couple that you've probably not heard of before. There's pt, which stands for points, and a point is 1/72 of an inch, and picas, pc, which is 12 points or 1/6 of an inch. So these are the units we can use in CSS when we want to define an absolute measurement or an absolute distance. Now, relative measurements have no fixed specific measurement, but actually depend on the size of something else. So a good example of a relative measurement is percentage, and it just so happens we can use percentage as a relative unit in CSS. Now if you think of it, a percentage doesn't have a fixed specific measurement. I can give you half a biscuit and half a cake. Now they're both half or 50%, but obviously the sizes are very different depending on the original size of the biscuit and depending on the original size of the cake. So percentage is a good example to think of when you think of relative measurements. But in CSS we have 3 other ones that are also commonly used. The first one is EX. Now EX refers to the height of the current font's lowercase x character. And we'll look at an example of this in a little while. EM is another unit for relative measurements, and it's the current font size. 1 EM is the current font size. 1.2 EM would be the current font size times 1.2. And if you had 2 EM, then that would make the font size twice the normal size. The final relative measurement is px, and this refers to screen pixels. Now, you might be thinking that screen pixels are absolute, but in CSS they're not, because they don't have a fixed physical measurement, as it will depend on the monitor or the screen in which the web page is being viewed. So we have 4 relative units: percentage, EX, EM, and PX. Now, just to try and help you get a grip of these different units, in the next video I'll show you examples of using them in CSS.